You are listening to the sound of your own breath, and it is the loudest thing left in the entire hemisphere. The air inside your throat feels like frozen velvet, scraped raw by the damp, salted chill that rolls off the James River at 3 in the morning. Outside the gaps in your rotting pine plank cabin, the world is a heavy, suffocating sheet of black. There are no lanterns burning across the square. There are no sentries pacing the palisades, with their matchlocks sputtering in the dark. There is only the low, rhythmic moan of the wind as it combs through the skeletal canopy of the Virginian wilderness. A vast, indifferent ocean of ancient oak and cypress that stretches inward for 1,000 miles, watching, waiting, and swallowing the tiny, desperate scar that humanity tried to carve into its edge. You pull the threadbare wool blanket tighter around your shoulders. But it offers no warmth. It has long since absorbed the greasy, stagnant moisture of the swamp. Your ribs press hard against your skin, sharp and fragile, like the stays of a broken ship. To move is to invite a deep, aching protest from your joints, a reminder that the meat of your body is slowly consuming itself to keep the pilot light of your consciousness flickering. This is the starving time. It is the winter of 1609, though the calendar has ceased to mean anything more than a record of frozen ground and empty kettles. When you look at your hands in the faint, graying twilight of the oncoming dawn, you do not see the hands of an adventurous colonist who sailed across the Atlantic in search of gold, land, or a new beginning. You see the hands of a ghost. The skin is translucent, stained with the charcoal of a dead hearth, and the dark loam of graves you dug until your arms could no longer lift the spade. You are one of the last. Perhaps, as the silence deepens around you, you are the very last person left breathing inside the wooden walls of Jamestown. You can hear the river shifting. It is a thick, brackish tide that moves with a deceptive, sluggish grace. In the spring, it looked like a highway to paradise, a deep-water anchorage where the great timber hulls of the Susan Constant and the Godspeed could tie directly to the trees. But that was the illusion that trapped you. The river does not bring life, it brings the sea's poison, trapping the filth of the fort in a stagnant, swirling eddy that never truly clears. It is an amber color, tasting of salt, mud, and the decay of 1,000 summers. For months, it has been your only drink, leaving a bitter, alkaline crust on your tongue and an unquenchable fire in your belly. The fort itself has grown strangely vast in its emptiness. When the ships first dropped anchor, the triangular walls felt cramped, bursting with the chaotic energy of over 100 men. There were the sharp, metallic rings of the blacksmith's anvil, the shouting of gentlemen refusing to clear the brush, the barked orders of Captain John Smith, and the constant, reassuring thud of axes felling the great pines. Now the space has opened up like a hollowed-out skull. The storehouse is wide open, its heavy oak doors sagging on rusted hinges, revealing nothing but dust, cobwebs, and the dried droppings of rats that died weeks ago when the grain ran out. The chapel, where you once gathered to pray for deliverance, stands dark, its thatch roof collapsing under the weight of winter snows, the pulpit covered in a fine layer of frost. You listen for the livestock, but the silence there is absolute. You remember the night the horses were taken, not by the Powhatan hunters who watch from the tree line, but by your own comrades, men driven mad by the sight of their own hip bones. You remember the smell of that meat, lean and stringy, boiled down to the very hooves in a desperate bid to extract grease. Then went the hogs, then the dogs, whose barks used to provide a comforting barrier against the terrifying stillness of the American night. Finally, the cats, and when they were gone, the mice. Now, there is not a single heartbeat within these 3 wooden walls that does not belong to a human being on the threshold of extinction. You stand up, your knees cracking like dry twigs in the stillness. The floorboards beneath your boots are slick with frost. Every motion must be deliberate now. To rush is to waste calories, and calories are the currency of survival in this wilderness. You step toward the small grease paper window of your cabin, peeling it back just enough to peer out into the triangular courtyard of the fort. The fog has settled in. It hangs low over the ground, a thick, milky broth that softens the sharp angles of the palisades. Through the veil, the empty cabins look like rotting teeth rising from the frozen earth. Many of them have been partially dismantled when the firewood ran out in December. Men did not have the strength to go into the forest to chop fresh logs. To step outside the gate was to invite a flint-tipped arrow from the brush. Instead, the colony began to eat itself from the inside out. First, the empty cabins of the dead were stripped of their thatch. Then the rafters were pried loose. Then the walls themselves were chopped down and fed into the fires, leaving behind only the stone chimneys, standing like lonely monuments in the mist. You watch a single flake of snow drift through the gap in your window, turning over and over in the gray light before landing on the back of your hand. It does not melt right away. Your skin is too cold to dissolve it instantly. You gaze at that tiny, perfect crystal and realize how beautiful this place is, in a cruel, terrifying way. This is not the English countryside you left behind, the soft, rolling green hills of Devon, or the crowded, smoky lanes of London, where the air smelled of sea coal and stale beer. This is an ancient, untamed world that does not care about the charters of King James or the investments of the Virginia Company. It does not hate you, nor does it love you. It simply exists, massive and heavy, and it is absorbing your presence as easily as it absorbs the falling snow. You remember the promises made in the taverns of London, where the recruiters spoke of Virginia as if it were a fruit ripe for the picking. They told stories of gold that could be gathered in handfuls from the riverbanks, of a climate so mild that the earth brought forth grain without the need for a plow, and of a passage to the South Sea that lay just beyond the next bend in the river. They showed maps with vast, empty spaces waiting to be filled with English names. They did not speak of the Ugg. They did not speak of the bloody flux that turns a strong man into a weeping child in 48 hours. They did not mention the long, suffocating heat of the Virginian summer when the air turns to steam and the mosquitoes rise from the marshes in clouds, so thick they choke the cattle. And they did not tell you about the silence. In London, you were never truly alone. Even in the dead of night, there was the cry of the watchman, the rumble of a cart on the cobblestones, or the distant, comforting chime of church bells across the Thames. Here, the silence has a physical weight. It presses against your ears until you start to hear things. The illusory sound of an English lark, the voice of a mother who died 10 years ago, or the distant, imaginary boom of a supply ship's cannon, signaling its arrival at Cape Henry. You have to shake your head to clear the delusions. But each time you do, the reality that rushes back in is colder and sharper than before. You walk to the corner of your cabin, where your iron pot sits over the cold ashes of yesterday's fire. You reach inside, your fingers scraping against the rough metal, searching for anything left behind. There is only a hardened residue of starch, the boiled remains of a leather boot heel you stewed for 12 hours yesterday, in an attempt to soften the tanned hide enough to swallow. It tasted of old grease and hemlock, but it filled the hollow, gnawing ache in your midsection for an hour or two. Now, even that is gone. Your eyes drift to the corner where your extra pair of shoes sits. They are made of good, thick English cowhide. You wonder if you have enough wood left to boil the left one today, or if you should save it for tomorrow, when the freeze is predicted to deepen. You look toward the main gate of the fort, its heavy timbers barred shut with a massive oak timber. That gate was built to keep the world out, but now it feels like the door to a tomb, keeping you in. Beyond that gate lies the forest, a wall of black pine and naked oak that seems to move and shift in the morning fog. You know that you are being watched. You have always been watched. The people who lived here for thousands of years before your great ships arrived, the subjects of the Powhatan, move through that forest like shadows through water. They know exactly how many of you are left. They know that your powder is damp, that your matchlocks are heavy with rust, and that the English sovereign has no power here. They do not even need to attack the fort anymore. In the beginning, there were skirmishes, the sudden, terrifying whistle of an arrow from the tall marsh grass, the panicked rush of the musketeers, the smoke of the ordnance clearing, to reveal a man pinned to the earth by a shaft of hickory. But now, the Powhatan have chosen a far more elegant weapon: time. They have simply drawn a circle around the fort and waited. They have cut off the trade for corn, knowing that the English cannot feed themselves from the mud of the peninsula. They are letting the winter do their work for them, letting the cold and the hunger dismantle the colony piece by piece until nothing is left but the empty timber walls. You hear a soft sound from the cabin next to yours, a low rhythmic scraping. For a moment, your heart leaps with a strange, desperate hope that someone else has found the strength to work. But as you listen closer, the sound is too rhythmic, too mechanical. It is the sound of a shovel hitting frozen dirt. Someone else has died in the night, and someone else is using the last of their earthly energy to bury them beneath the floorboards. That is what you do now. You do not bury the dead in the churchyard anymore. The ground outside is too hard, and the danger of stepping beyond the palisade is too great. Instead, you dig holes inside the homes, burying your friends beneath the very places where they once slept, until the entire fort becomes a tiered cemetery, a city built on top of its own ancestors. You step out of your cabin into the open air of the courtyard. The cold hits you like a physical blow, knocking the breath from your lungs and making your vision go dark around the edges for a terrifying second. You steady yourself against the rough-hewn log of your doorway, waiting for the world to stop spinning. The air is perfectly clear now, the fog beginning to lift as the sun rises, a pale, heatless disk of silver behind the gray clouds. As the light spreads across the fort, you see the true scale of the desolation. There are no tracks in the light dusting of snow, save for your own uneven footprints. The communal well in the center of the square is frozen solid, its wooden bucket encased in a thick jacket of ice. A few weeks ago, men would gather there to gossip about the London companies, to curse the governors, or to speculate on when Lord Delawar's relief fleet might finally round the point. Now there is no talk. The remaining souls stay hidden away in their dark holes, conserving their breath, waiting for the end or for a miracle, whichever arrives first. You look down at your boots, your breath rising in long, slow plumes of white vapor that linger in the still air Before vanishing into the wilderness, you realize that you have reached a profound and terrible crossroads. The story of Jamestown is no longer about empire, gold, or the expansion of the kingdom. It has shrunk down to the most primal equation known to existence: the simple, brutal act of surviving the next hour. You are the custodian of this forgotten outpost, the lonely witness to a grand dream that has frozen into a nightmare. And as you take your next slow, deliberate step across the courtyard, you know that the story of how you got here and what you will have to do to see the tomorrow is carved into every stone, every log, and every grave beneath your feet. You close your eyes, and the biting wind of Virginia fades, replaced by the heavy, suffocating scent of London mud, stale beer, and the sulphurous smoke of sea coal fires. Before you were a ghost in the new world, you were a body in the old. You can still feel the damp chill of a London November, a cold that did not kill you, but lingered in your bones like an unpaid debt. You remember standing on the slippery timber wharves of Wapping, watching the Thames churn with the filth of 200,000 souls. In that world, you were a man trapped in the gears of an empire that was growing too large for its own island. The commons had been enclosed. The green fields, where your grandfather raised sheep, were now fenced off by wealthy landlords, leaving a generation of men with nothing to inherit but the open road and the threat of the genders. You were not a gentleman with a silk doublet and a family crest, nor were you a hardened criminal, spared from the gallows on the condition that you sail west. You were somewhere in the fragile middle, a man who had seen his trade collapse, or perhaps a younger son with a literate mind but an empty purse. You remember the broadsides nailed to the tavern walls, printed in heavy black ink that stained your fingertips. They spoke of the Virginia Company with a religious fervor. They called it a holy enterprise, a paradise where the soil was so rich that a man could plant a seed and step back before it tripped him. They promised that every man who indentured himself for 7 years would receive 100 acres of his own land, a kingdom for a peasant. In the dark of the Mermaid Tavern, under the low, grease-blackened rafters, you listened to the recruiters. They were smooth-tongued men who smelled of Spanish tobacco and sweet sack. They showed samples of what they claimed was Virginian earth, dark, loam-heavy dirt that supposedly sparkled with the promise of gold. They did not show you the graves. They did not tell you about the 5 out of 6 men who had already died in the first 2 years of the settlement. They painted a picture of a clean slate, a place where the grime of London could be washed away in the pure waters of a new Eden. And you, sitting there with a half-empty tankard and the dread of debtor's prison pressing against your chest, believed them because you had to. You remember the morning you boarded the ship. The air was thick with the scent of tar, salted beef, and the damp wool of 100 men crammed into a hull no larger than a merchant shop. The voyage was not a grand adventure. It was an entry into a floating purgatory. For 4 months, you lived in the twilight between the decks, where the ceiling was so low you could never stand fully upright. The world became a shifting, groaning beast of oak timbers that creaked under the assault of the Atlantic rollers. You learned to sleep to the rhythm of the bilge water sloshing beneath the floorboards, a foul black soup of vinegar, rat droppings, and human sweat. The food turned to stone within weeks. The hardtack biscuits became small fortresses for the weevil larvae, which you learned to tap out against the table in the dark so you wouldn't have to see what you were eating. The salted pork grew green and slick with slime, tasting of salt so bitter it made your gums bleed. You watched men, strong, boisterous lads from the shires, wither away before the mid-Atlantic was crossed. They died of the dry bellyache, their intestines knotting up until their screams filled the lower decks, or they succumbed to the burning fevers that made them curse their mothers and leap toward imaginary green fields through the gun ports. When a man died, there was no dignity. The carpenter would wrap him in his own hammock, stitch the heavy canvas closed across his face, taking care to run the final stitch through his nose to ensure he was truly gone, and drop him over the side with 2 iron balls at his feet. You would stand on the tilting deck, the cold sea spray stinging your face, and watch that gray shape slide into the gray water. There was no monument, no marker, no spot on a map. The ocean simply opened its mouth, took the offering, and closed again, leaving the living to look at one another and wonder who would be the next to feed the sharks. And then came the arrival. You remember the first sight of Cape Henry in April. The low, green line of the coast rising out of the morning mist, like a promise from God. After months of gray water and the stench of the bilge, the air that blew off the land was intoxicating. It smelled of pine resin, damp earth, and the sweet wild strawberries that were blooming in the woods. Men fell to their knees on the deck, weeping and shouting praises to the heavens. It seemed that the recruiters had been right after all. This was paradise, but you did not stop at the Cape. The orders from the London Council were explicit. You had to sail inland, up the great river they named the James, to find a site that could be easily defended against the Spanish caravels that cruised the coast. You traveled 50 miles up the winding waterway, past dark forests that seemed to press down on the riverbanks, until you reached a low, marshy peninsula that connected to the mainland by a narrow spit of sand. It was a place that no Indian tribe inhabited. To your English eyes, this was a sign of God's providence, a piece of land left open just for you. You did not know then why the Powhatan avoided that peninsula. You did not understand that the ground was a trap. The soil was a thin crust of sand over a bed of stagnant muck. The water in the creeks was brackish, a mixture of river water and sea tide that trapped the filth of the settlement and bred the long, thin mosquitoes that carried the ague in their bellies. It was a place designed by nature to breed pestilence. But to your leaders, men who knew about military fortifications, but nothing about farming or survival, it was perfect. It had deep water close to the shore where the ships could tie up, and 3 sides were protected by the river. You built your prison and called it a fort. You remember the internal rot that began before the first log was even notched. The colony was divided by an invisible, fatal line. On one side were the gentlemen, nearly half of the original company, men of blood and title, who had never held an axe in their lives and had no intention of starting now. They brought their gold-trimmed doublets, their rapiers, and their private servants, but they did not bring plows or hunting hounds. They expected to find an empire like the Spanish had found in Peru, where they could gold-wash the rivers and command an indigenous peasantry to feed them. On the other side were the laborers, the tradesmen, and the soldiers. You watched the gentlemen spend their days digging up the riverbanks, searching for a yellow mica they swore was gold, while the corn stores in the ship's hold dwindled to nothing. They spent more time quarreling over precedence. Who should sit where at the council table? Whose family was older? Who had the right to command? Than they did planting crops. They treated the wilderness as a temporary inconvenience, an annoying waiting room before they returned to London as wealthy men. You remember Captain John Smith, the one man who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He was a coarse, scarred soldier of fortune who had fought the Turks in Hungary and had no patience for aristocratic vanity. You can still hear his rough, booming voice echoing across the clearing. "He that will not work shall not eat." He forced the gentlemen to cut timber until their soft hands were raw and bleeding. They hated him for it. They plotted against him, wrote letters full of venom to the London investors, and tried to have him executed on trumped-up charges of mutiny. The atmosphere within the fort was a venomous soup of suspicion and pride, a slow poison that was far more dangerous than the wilderness outside. Then there was the first winter, the one that should have warned you. The supplies from the first ships were gone by August, and the sickness arrived with the heat. You remember the sound of the fort at night during that first summer. Not a silence, but a chorus of groans and dry heaves. Men became yellow-skinned and bloated, their minds unhinged by the malaria that rose from the swamp. You would look out from your cabin and see men crawling across the dirt on their hands and knees, too weak to stand, searching for a drop of fresh water that didn't taste of salt and slime. You survived that first culling by sheer chance, or perhaps because your body possessed some hidden resilience that the others lacked. You buried 30 men in a single month. You dug the graves wide and shallow, tumbling the bodies in without coffins, sometimes 3 or 4 to a ditch, because there were not enough living men with the strength to dig individual holes. You watched the colony shrink from over 100 down to less than 40, a miserable remnant that only survived because the Powhatan took pity on you and brought baskets of corn and squash to the gates. That was the great irony you now understand. Your survival had always been a gift from the people you considered savages. You remember the first time you saw the Powhatan hunters. They were tall, straight-limbed men who moved through the brush without making a sound, their skin dark with oil and charcoal, their eyes bright and cold. They looked at you not with fear, but with an amused, detached curiosity. They saw you as weak, clumsy children who could not even find the edible roots that grew beneath your feet. They fed you because their chief, the great Powhatan, wished to use your steel axes and copper kettle to expand his own empire over the rival tribes. You were not the masters of the New World. You were merely a strange, dependent client state huddled on a malaria-ridden island. You stand in the cold light of 1609, looking down at your boots, remembering how that fragile peace shattered when John Smith was injured by a gunpowder explosion and forced to return to England in the autumn. The last string of discipline snapped. The men who took control were the very gentlemen who hated him. They refused to trade fairly with the Powhatan. They stole corn from their villages, burned their temples, and treated the indigenous hunters with a brutal, arrogant violence born of their own terror. The response from the Longhouse was swift and absolute. The Powhatan did not launch a massive, suicidal assault on the fort's cannons. They simply withdrew their women, their corn, and their mercy. They cut off the paths, they hid in the tall reeds, and whenever an Englishman stepped beyond the palisade to gather firewood or hunt for walnuts, an arrow would find his throat. They turned the forest into a wall of sharp wood and silence. They hemmed you in, knowing that the winter was coming and that the English had no stores to last through the frost. Now, as you look at the empty cabins around you, you see the final result of that pride. The colony was built on a foundation of lies. Lies told in London taverns, lies written on parchment charters, and lies you told yourself to keep from screaming during the long voyage across the sea. You came here to build a new world, but you succeeded only in bringing the oldest parts of the old world with you: the greed, the vanity, and the inability to see the reality of the earth beneath your feet. The shadows of your origin have caught up with you, and they are freezing you to the bone. You remember the brief, intoxicating moment when it felt like you were winning. Every tragedy has its golden hour, that deceptive crest of the wave before it breaks against the rocks. And for Jamestown, that hour arrived in the spring of 1608. The first devastating culling of the malaria summer had passed, and the first supply ships had crawled back up the river, bringing fresh faces, sweet English meal, and the ferocious, stabilizing iron will of Captain John Smith. For a few short months, the air inside the fort didn't smell of rot. It smelled of fresh cedar shavings, wood smoke, and the sharp, clean sweat of men who believed they were conquering a continent. You were swept up in that great momentum. Survival, you realized, was a ladder that had to be climbed with blood on your fingers. You stopped being a passive observer of the colony's slow decay and became one of the hands that held it together. You learned the language of the axe and the cross-cut saw. You spent your days in the great pine forests across the neck of land, your muscles hardening under a coat of dark resin and dirt, your shoulders growing broad from the endless rhythm of felling trees to feed the insatiable demand of the ships returning to London. The company wanted cedar for the paneling of London mansions. They wanted clapboard. They wanted pitch and tar and pot ashes to fuel the glassworks of England. And so, under the fierce, unblinking glare of Smith, you worked. You remember the sound of 40 axes striking wood in unison, a rhythmic, mechanical thunder that echoed across the river and announced to the silent wilderness that the English were no longer merely dying. They were building. You felt a strange, fierce pride during those long, exhausting days. You were no longer the desperate, broke soul from Wapping. You were a pioneer, an architect of an empire, clearing the ancient dark to make way for the light of King James. You watched the gray dawn illuminate the empty barracks across the courtyard, remembering how that ascent required you to harden your heart against your own kind. The discipline that saved the colony was not gentle. It was a cold, militaristic machine that ground down anyone who lacked the stomach for the frontier. You remember the gentlemen who had arrived with silk stockings and dreams of gold-washed rivers, their hands turning to a mass of blisters within 48 hours of holding an axe. They wept from the pain, cursing Smith, cursing the Virginia Company, and cursing the day they were born. To stop their complaints and their constant mutinous whispering, Smith instituted a brutal system of public justice. A ledger was kept by the well in the center of the square, and every man's daily labor was recorded with ruthless precision. If a man swore an oath out of anger or exhaustion, his sins were recorded, and at night, for every oath spoken, a gallon of cold river water was poured down his sleeve into his armpit before the assembled colony. You watched proud men, heirs to grand estates in Sussex, broken by a bucket of brackish water and the laughter of common laborers. You chose your side early, You became an enforcer of that cold order. You realized that, if the gentlemen did not work, the laborers would starve alongside them, and so you stood by Smith when he drew his pistol on the lazy, the malingerers, and the counselors who tried to hoard the remaining wine and oatmeal in their private cabins. You helped build the great blockhouse at the neck of the peninsula, a heavy timber fort where every man had to pass through a narrow gate and account for his day's work before he was granted his evening ration of 3 ounces of moldy flour. It was a tyranny, yes, but it was a holy tyranny. The only thing standing between 100 men and an open ditch in the swamp. And then there was the trade, the dangerous, delicate game of diplomacy and steel played with the Powhatan. You were selected to join the trading parties that sailed up the York and Chickahominy rivers, crammed into a small open barge with 15 musketeers, their match cords burning in the dark like angry fireflies. You remember the terrifying beauty of those voyages, moving deep into the interior of a country that had no roads, where the trees grew so thick they shut out the sun, and the river water turned from brackish to sweet, cool spring. You would round a bend and see a Powhatan village rising from the riverbank. Long, curved houses built of saplings and woven reed mats, glowing softly from the fires within. Hundreds of people would gather on the shore, their bodies painted in bright patterns of red root and white clay, their hair adorned with the wings of birds and the rattles of snakes. They did not shout. They stood in a dense, unnatural silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. You could feel the weight of 1,000 bows, drawn in the shadows of the brush, waiting for a single false move. You learned the art of the trade from Smith, who never showed a shadow of fear. When the local chiefs tried to demand your muskets and swords in exchange for their baskets of corn, Smith would smile, pick up a handful of blue glass beads, cheap trinkets manufactured in the back alleys of London, and hold them up to the sunlight. He would tell the chiefs that these were rare gems, worn only by the greatest kings of Europe, jewels that possessed the color of the midnight sky. You watched the hunters, men who could kill a deer at 70 paces in total darkness, look at those cheap pieces of glass with an expression of pure wonder. You traded iron hatchets and copper kettles for enough corn to fill the barge to the gunwales, laughing in your sleeve at how easily the wilderness could be bought. But the wilderness was not bought. It was merely biding its time. You remember the day the crown arrived from London, a ridiculous, gold-plated gauntlet sent by the investors of the Virginia Company, who insisted that the great chief Powhatan must be crowned as a vassal of King James. It was an act of supreme, arrogant ignorance. You were part of the guard that marched into the great emperor's capital at Werowocomoco to deliver the gift. You stood inside the massive longhouse, 60 feet long, lit by 3 great hearths that sent smoke curling into the rafters. Powhatan sat upon a raised platform covered in raccoon skins, surrounded by his many wives and his tallest warriors. He was an old man, over 60, with a massive chest, a face lined like a walnut shell, and eyes that looked through you as if you were made of glass. When the governors tried to force him to kneel so they could place the crown upon his head, he refused to bend his neck. He stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest, looking down at the English gentleman with a mixture of pity and contempt. In the end, 3 or 4 men had to press down on his shoulders to force a slight bend in his knees, while the crown was hurried onto his brow. Powhatan did not rage. He simply smiled a cold, thin smile and presented the English governor with his old, discarded leather mantle and a pair of his tattered, deerskin shoes in return for the crown of England. It was a profound, silent victory. He was telling you that he knew exactly who was the master of this land and who was the beggar. You marched back to the fort with the corn you had traded for, but as you looked at the tattered mantle of the chief, you felt a cold premonition that the blue glass beads would not protect you forever. You looked down at the frozen mud of the courtyard, where the timber of the blockhouse now sags, half burned for firewood. The ascent ended on a hot afternoon in September, when a spark from a matchlock fell into Captain John Smith's powder horn as he lay asleep in his boat. The explosion tore the flesh from his thigh in great, smoking ribbons, screaming in agony as he leaped into the river to quench the fire. When they dragged him out, his face was gray with shock, and you knew, looking at his shattered leg, that the spine of the colony had been snapped. He was put aboard the next ship for London, his body wrapped in greasy linens, leaving the fort in the hands of the very gentleman he had humiliated with his ledger and his buckets of cold water. You stood on the wharf and watched the sails of his ship disappear past Hog Island, feeling a sudden, hollow drop in your stomach. The crowd of laborers around you was silent. The iron hand that had forced men to plant, to build, and to fear the ledger was gone, and the men who replaced him were fools who believed that authority was something inherited through blood rather than earned through steel. Within a week of Smith's departure, the work stopped. The ledger was thrown into the mud. The gentlemen returned to their cabins to drink their private stores of sack and play dice for land they did not yet own. The laborers refused to go into the forest to clear brush without the threat of the armpit bucket. The great ascent, the short, glorious moment where Jamestown felt like a living city, ground to an unceremonious halt. The discipline vanished like mist over the river, leaving behind a company of men who had forgotten how to obey and had never learned how to govern themselves. You take a slow, rattling breath, the frost coating your lips as you look toward the Palisades. The Powhatan knew the very hour the captain left. Their scouts, who had watched the fort from the tall grass for 2 years, saw the change in the guard. They saw the sentries sleeping on their weapons. They saw the firewood gatherers wandering into the woods without their muskets. They saw the complete breakdown of the order that had made the English dangerous. They did not wait. The first trading party, sent out by the new governors, was lured into an ambush with promises of grain. Out of 30 men, only one crawled back to the fort, his body bristling with arrows like a porcupine. The rest were tortured in the woods, within earshot of the walls, their screams drifting over the tree line during the long autumn nights to remind you that the price of your arrogance was being calculated in the dark. You had climbed the ladder of survival to the very top, but as the first frost of November settled over the peninsula, you looked down and realized that the rungs beneath your feet had already turned to rot. You are standing at the absolute center of a dead world, and you realize that the greatest horror is not the hunger, but the scale of your loneliness. By December of 1609, the circle had closed entirely. The small spit of sand connecting your peninsula to the mainland had become a gauntlet of death. To cross it was to disappear into the quiet of the woods and never return. The great Atlantic Ocean, which had once felt like a highway back to the taverns of London, was now an insurmountable desert of gray, freezing water 3,000 miles wide. You were no longer an outpost of an empire. You were an island of dying men trapped on the edge of a continent that did not know your name and did not care to learn it. The illusion of your superiority had vanished with the last of the ship's biscuits. You remember the day the realization settled over the fort like a heavy, suffocating fog. The day you looked around the council table and saw that the men who wore the finest lace were just as hollow-cheeked and desperate as the boys from the London gutters. There was no more talk of gold, no more planning for silk works or tobacco plantations. The entire purpose of the human mind had shrunk down to a single, agonizing calculation: how to make the sun rise one more time on your own face. The silence grew heavy, thick with the weight of an ancient winter that had been brewing in the American interior for a millennium. In England, the winter was a social season, a time for roaring hearths, roasted apples, and the crowded warmth of parish churches. Here, the winter was an invading army that took your perimeter yard by yard. The river froze over along the banks, a jagged crust of yellow-gray ice that groaned in the night like a dying beast. The wind didn't just blow, it searched through the gaps in the green pine logs of your cabin, finding every rip in your doublet and every crack in your skin, leaving you numb and stiff. Before the midnight watch was even halfway through, you remember the weight of the crown, not a literal crown of gold, but the terrible responsibility of being one of the few who still possess the strength to stand upright. As the governors and the councilors retreated into their private quarters to die in the dark, the daily management of the apocalypse fell to a handful of men who refused to lie down. You became one of the watchers. You spent your days moving from cabin to cabin, checking on the shapes that lay curled in the corners under piles of wet straw and tattered cloaks. It was a ghoulish tally. You would walk into a room where 3 men had been sleeping the night before, only to find that 2 of them had grown cold hours ago, their skins stiffening into the shape of the frozen earth beneath them. The 3rd man would often be too weak to push the corpses away, lying there in the dark, breathing in the scent of his companion's decay, his eyes wide and vacant as they stared at the rafters. You would lift the dead by their ankles, dragging them out into the frost alone, their heels bumping softly against the dirt floor with a sound that haunted your dreams long after the sun went down. And as you performed this grim duty, you felt a strange, icy detachment growing inside your chest. The empathy that makes a man human was a luxury that cost too many calories. You stopped weeping when a boy you had known since the voyage died in your arms. You stopped praying over the shallow trenches you dug inside the empty kitchens. You became a machine of pure survival, a collection of bone and sinew that moved because it was programmed to move, while the soul inside you retreated deep into some hidden, unfeeling core to keep from shattering under the weight of what you were witnessing. You remember when the true madness began, the winter rot of the mind that turned men into beasts. It started with the delusions. Men would wake in the middle of the night screaming that the cabins were on fire or that a great Spanish fleet had anchored in the river, its hulls bursting with sweet wine and roasted beef. They would run out into the snow in nothing but their shirts, laughing and singing London street songs until the cold took their legs from beneath them and they collapsed into the drifts, their voices fading into a rhythmic whimper before the frost silenced them for good. Then came the hunger that logic could no longer control. You watched men dig into the frozen mud of the courtyard with their bare fingernails, searching for earthworms, grubs, or any living thing that might possess a drop of moisture. They tore the leather linings from their muskets and chewed on them for hours until their gums were shredded and bleeding. They boiled their own grease-soaked caps, their belts, and the scabbards of their rapiers, creating a foul, gelatinous broth that smelled of old sweat and tanning liquor, swallowing it down with a desperate animal ferocity. You look toward the corner of the square where the blacksmith's forge once stood, remembering the night the line of humanity was crossed forever. It was a silent night, the air so cold it felt as though it would crack if you spoke. A whisper began to circulate through the cabins, a rumor that someone in the lower block had not starved, that his pot had smelled of meat during the midnight watch. When you broke down the door of that cabin, your matchlock cocked, you did not find the carcass of a dog or a hidden store of salted pork. You found a man sitting before a small heap of coals, his face smeared with grease, holding a piece of flesh that had been carved from the hip of his roommate who had died that morning. The punishment was swift, but it felt hollow. A performance of English law in a place where the law had no meaning. The man was tied to a post by the frozen well, his body stripped to the waist in the biting wind, and he was burned with a hot iron before being left to freeze to death in the center of the square. But as you watched his breath slow and his head drop against his chest, you didn't feel a sense of justice. You felt a terrifying certainty that he had merely been the first to do what the rest of you would soon consider. The hunger was no longer an empty space in your belly. It was a physical presence, a heavy clawed thing that sat upon your chest and whispered in your ear while you tried to sleep. It told you that the dead were no longer your brothers, your friends, or your countrymen. They were resources. It told you that the wood of the coffins was wasted warmth, and that the flesh of the fallen was the only thing that could keep the spark of your own life from going out. You fought the whisper with everything you had left, clinging to the memory of your mother's kitchen, the prayers you had learned as a child, and the image of an English churchyard where the dead lay undisturbed beneath the ivy. But every day the whisper grew louder, and every day your knees grew weaker. You look out at the river now, where the silver light of the heatless sun plays across the moving water. The isolation was total, because you knew that even if a ship were to round the point tomorrow, it would not find a colony. It would find a monument to a colossal mistake. The Virginia Company had sent you here like cattle to a slaughterhouse, providing you with no tools to adapt, no knowledge of the land, and no leadership, save for arrogant men who preferred to starve in their silk cloaks rather than learn how to live from the people who owned the soil. You realized then that you were the true savages. You were the ones who had come to a land of abundance and managed to starve within sight of rivers teeming with sturgeon and forests filled with deer. You were the ones who had brought the plague of your greed and your pride to this clean place, and the earth was simply rejecting you, vomiting you out as an infection that had no place in its ancient order. The ultimate isolation was the realization that you were completely alone in your guilt, that the wilderness was not your enemy, but your judge, and that its verdict was being written in the frost that was creeping up the walls of your fort. You are watching the final, agonizing collapse of an illusion, and the splintering is happening inside your own mind. By February of 1606, the social fabric of Jamestown did not simply unravel. It dissolved into a primitive soup. The authority of the council had become a dark joke. The governor, George Percy, lay bedridden in his cabin, his legs swollen with scurvy, his mind wandering through the rose gardens of his family's estate in Northumberland, while his men ate the thatch off his roof. There were no longer shifts assigned for the watch, no longer gatherings for prayer, and no longer any distinction between the gentleman and the scavenger. The empire that aimed to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific had shrunk to the width of a single rotting cabin where 4 men lay staring at each other, waiting to see who would draw their last breath first. You remember the night the final fracture occurred, the night the remaining men realized that no help was coming. A group of 5 soldiers, men who had survived the battlefields of Flanders before coming to Virginia, broke into the remaining armory. They did not steal the muskets to defend the walls. They took the remaining black powder to blow the lock off the small pinnace, the Discovery, which lay rocked in the ice near the wharf. They intended to abandon the colony, to slip down the river under the cover of darkness, and risk the open Atlantic in a boat no larger than a London ferry, preferring the mercy of a midwinter storm to another 48 hours inside the fort. You stood in the dark, a rusted halberd in your trembling hands, confronting them on the slippery timbers of the wharf. The wind was howling off the river, carrying the smell of salt and old mud. When you raised your weapon, the leader of the deserters didn't reach for his sword. He simply looked at you through eyes that were sunken so deep into his skull, they looked like empty sockets. He didn't speak of treason, or of the king, or of the Virginia Company. He whispered a single sentence that froze you faster than the winter wind. "There is nothing left to save here, brother. We are already dead. We are just waiting for our limbs to realize it." You let the halberd drop. Your arm simply didn't possess the will to hold the heavy iron upright anymore. You watched them push the small boat off into the black, ice-choked water, their oars dipping silently into the river like the legs of a water strider. They disappeared into the fog within seconds, leaving you alone on the edge of the timber pier. They never made it to the sea. 3 days later, the shattered hull of the Discovery was found washed up on the mud flats of Hog Island, its sides crushed by the ice floes, the bodies of the soldiers frozen into the floorboards like salted fish. The colony was eating itself, piece by piece, bone by bone. The fracturing was visible in the very architecture of the fort. You remember walking through the square and watching a man you had known as a proud tailor from London systematically dismantling the chapel pulpit with a hand axe. He wasn't doing it out of malice or anger. His face was perfectly calm, almost holy, as he split the carved oak into small, clean kindling to boil a single handful of wild roots he had dug from the swamp. The church, the laws, the language, everything that made you an Englishman was being stripped away and burned just to keep the blood moving through your veins for another 20 minutes. The gray twilight of March arrived, and with it came the final, terrifying breakdown of human identity. You stopped using names. When you spoke of the people in the neighboring cabins, you referred to them by their physical state. The one with the black leg, the one who crawls, the one who stopped screaming yesterday. To use a name was to acknowledge a relationship, and relationships were a danger. If you loved a man, you would have to carry him to the floorboards when he died, and you simply didn't have the grease left in your joints to lift him. The silence within the walls became total. broken only by the rhythmic, wet cough of the dying and the occasional, sudden crack of a pine tree splitting open in the deep forest. From the intensity of the frost, you are sitting in the gray light of a late April morning, and the world has grown so quiet that you can hear the ice melting in the reeds. Out of the 500 souls who had been living inside these walls when the autumn leaves turned yellow, less than 60 remain. You are one of the walking dead, a skeletal remnant that has somehow defied the mathematics of the starving time. The fog is lifting from the James River, turning from a heavy slate gray to a brilliant, blinding white as the spring sun finally finds its teeth. For the first time in 6 months, the wind does not carry the scent of frost. It carries the damp, sweet smell of waking mud and the first green shoots of the marsh grass. But the warmth brings no joy. It brings only the revelation of what you have done to survive. As the snow melts from the courtyard, it reveals the true archaeology of your winter. The ground is a patchwork of shallow mounds and uneven depressions where the earth has settled over the bodies buried beneath the surface. The entire fort has become a monument to human failure, a place where every log is scorched by desperation, and every corner holds the memory of a shadow that did not make it to the spring. You realize that if you ever return to England, you will never be able to speak of this place to anyone who did not live through it. How do you tell a London shopkeeper about the taste of boiled leather? How do you explain to a church congregation that you watched men barter their family heirlooms, their silver rings, and their souls for The echoes of the lost are everywhere. When you look at the forest across the neck of land, you no longer see a wilderness to be conquered. You see a permanent wall that has witnessed your humiliation. The Powhatan hunters still move through those trees like spirits, their shadows blending seamlessly with the oak bark. They do not need to shoot you. They have won the war without firing a single arrow since January. They look at your broken walls and your sagging gate with a detached, historical curiosity, knowing that the earth has reclaimed the peninsula and that the English dream has been reduced to a heap of ash and bone. You stand by the frozen well, your hands buried deep in the pockets of your tattered coat, looking out toward the mouth of the river. The delusions have returned, but they are different now. They are no longer terrifying. They are soft, rhythmic, and seductive. You hear the phantom sound of a ship's bell ringing across the water, a low bronze chime that seems to vibrate through the very soles of your boots. You shake your head to clear the sound, but it doesn't vanish. It grows louder, sharper, accompanied by the distant, unmistakable white thump of a canvas sail catching the wind around the distant point of Hog Island. You look again, squinting against the glare of the morning sun on the water. Through the shimmering mist, two shapes are rising from the river, not the grand, multi-decked galleons of the Spanish fleet, and not the heavy timber hulls of the Virginia Company's relief ships. They are two small, battered pinnaces, the Deliverance and the Patience, built from the wreckage of the Sea Venture on the reefs of Bermuda by men who had been presumed dead a year ago. They are coming up the river like ghosts returning from the sea, their white sails stained with salt and tobacco smoke, their decks crowded with men who look healthy, whole, and completely unprepared for what they are about to find inside your gate. You do not run to the wharf. You do not shout and you do not weep. You simply sit down on the rough pine log of your cabin step, your back resting against the grease-stained wall, and you watch the ships approach with the detached interest of a man watching a play from the back row of a theater. The gates of Jamestown are thrown open from the outside by the arriving sailors, the heavy oak timbers groaning on their rusted hinges as they slide back into the mud. When Sir Thomas Gates and the survivors of the Bermuda shipwreck step into the triangular courtyard, they do not find an empire. They stop dead in their tracks, their faces turning pale beneath their sea-tanned skin. They look at the empty chimneys, standing like gravestones, the collapsed roofs of the barracks, and the handful of skeletal figures that crawl out from the dark of the cabins into the unaccustomed brilliance of the spring sun. The silence that follows their arrival is more profound than the silence of the winter. They see the ledger in the mud. They see the condition of your clothes, which have not been washed or changed since the previous autumn. They see the look in your eyes, that cold, unblinking stare that belongs only to men who have looked into the center of the earth and found nothing there. The governor steps toward you, his leather boots clicking sharply against the frozen dirt, his hand resting on the hilt of his polished rapier. He asks you a question, his voice sounding thin and artificial in the vastness of the clearing. Who is in command here? You do not answer him. You cannot. The language of London, the words for titles, laws, and companies, feels like an ancient dialect you forgot a lifetime ago. You simply point your thin, charcoal-stained finger toward the center of the square, where the graves lie thickest beneath the melting snow. You are telling him that the wilderness is in command. You are telling him that the river, the frost, and the hunger have taken the charter of King James and torn it into kindling to feed the fires of your survival. Within 3 days, the decision is made. The new governors look at the desolation of the fort, the poison of the water, and the ghosts that inhabit the cabins, and they realize that Jamestown cannot be saved. The order is given to abandon the settlement. You are carried aboard one of the pinnaces, your fragile body laid upon a clean canvas hammock that smells of cedar wood and fresh Atlantic air. You look out through the small gun port as the ships drop down the river with the tide, watching the triangular walls of the fort grow smaller and smaller against the greening line of the forest until they are nothing more than a tiny dark speck on the edge of the world. As the ship rounds the point and the open ocean opens up before the bow, a profound, heavy peace begins to settle over your chest. The long, agonizing watch is over. The starving time has released its grip on your throat, leaving you with nothing but the slow, rhythmic rocking of the ship as it climbs and descends the long, gentle rollers of the Atlantic. The memories of the leather boots, the frozen graves, and the silence of the Virginia woods begin to soften around the edges, turning into a gray, distant dream that can no longer reach you. You close your eyes, your breath slowing to the match of the sea's deep pulse, and you finally, safely let yourself slide into the deep, dark luxury of a sleep that has been earned through the very bone of your existence.